They didn't want little old me because I wasn't a big enough star, so they would go for, the top female of the time, female actress of the time, and that was Elizabeth.
What happens when two of the most glamorous women in Hollywood find themselves chasing the same spotlight, the same roles, and even the same men? At 92, Joan Collins has spoken more openly than ever about her long and complicated history with Elizabeth Taylor. Their story is not just about fame, but about betrayal, jealousy, and a rivalry that began with a crown meant for Cleopatra. Collins was poised to wear it until the studio gave the role to Taylor, a decision that changed both of their lives forever. What followed was a tangled web of competition and connection, filled with stolen opportunities, stormy relationships, and a surprising twist of friendship in the end. The truth Collins has revealed about Taylor is far more layered than the headlines ever suggested, and it still raises questions today. In the early 1960s, Joan Collins had every reason to believe Cleopatra would be hers. Signed by 20th Century Fox, she had already begun preparing for one of the most ambitious films in Hollywood history. Collins was in her late 20s, strikingly beautiful, with the kind of charisma that could hold an audience. Executives initially viewed her as the perfect choice for the legendary Egyptian queen. The contract was drawn up, screen tests were discussed, and industry insiders assumed her career was about to soar to unprecedented heights. But Collins soon learned that in Hollywood, no role was ever truly secure. Behind the scenes, Elizabeth Taylor was watching. At the time, Taylor was already considered one of the most famous women in the world. She was a two-time Academy Award winner, a household name, and a star whose every move made headlines. When she let it be known that she wanted Cleopatra, the studio's priorities shifted instantly. Fox executives, dazzled by the idea of Taylor's box office draw, offered her a record-breaking salary, $1 million, the largest ever paid to an actress at the time. For Collins, who had been on the cusp of history, it was a devastating blow. The decision to replace her was not just a matter of business. It left a scar. Cleopatra went on to become infamous, not just for its extravagant sets and ballooning budget, but for the scandalous romance between Taylor and Richard Burton that began during filming. Their affair dominated headlines worldwide, elevating Taylor into a cultural phenomenon beyond cinema. Meanwhile, Collins was left to watch as the role that might have redefined her career instead became the cornerstone of Taylor's legend. Years later, Collins reflected on how that moment shaped her perception of Taylor. She admitted that it was not only about losing a role, it felt like losing ground in a race she had been running since the start of her career. Taylor seemed to embody everything Collins had been told she was destined for: adoration, power, and influence in a male-dominated industry. To the world, Taylor was a goddess on and off screen. To Collins, she was a rival who always seemed to be one step ahead. But Cleopatra was just the beginning. Not long after, Collins found herself drawn into a relationship with the very same man who had once darkened Taylor's life. And what unfolded there was darker, more shocking, and far more personal than any lost film role. If losing Cleopatra felt like a professional betrayal, Joan Collins's next brush with Elizabeth Taylor's shadow cut even deeper. Because this time, it was not about Hollywood contracts or studio politics, it was about a man, and not just any man. Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., the heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune, and Elizabeth Taylor's first husband. Taylor had married Nicky in 1950 at just 18 years old. What the world saw was a glamorous young couple at the altar, a Hollywood princess matched with American royalty. What Taylor experienced behind closed doors was something else entirely. Their marriage was marred by his heavy drinking, gambling, and explosive temper. It lasted only 8 months, but it left scars that Taylor carried for years. Decades later, Joan Collins would discover those scars firsthand. Collins began seeing Hilton not long after his split from Taylor, and what started as a whirlwind romance quickly turned into something far more volatile. In her memoir, she described terrifying incidents that revealed the darker side of his charm. One night, after an argument, Hilton allegedly pulled out a gun and fired a shot into the ceiling while she was in bed. It was the kind of shocking moment that shattered any illusion of safety and showed Collins just how unstable he could be. To the public, Hilton remained the dashing playboy heir. To both Taylor and Collins, he was a man whose wealth and status could not disguise the chaos he brought into a relationship. For Collins, the parallels were impossible to ignore. She was not just competing with Taylor on the screen, she was living through the same stormy nightmare Taylor had already endured. It added a deeply personal edge to a rivalry that was already simmering beneath the surface. Collins later admitted that being connected to the same man felt like a cruel twist of fate. While Taylor had managed to break free from Hilton's grip quickly, Collins stayed entangled longer, hoping his temper would soften and his promises would prove true. Instead, she found herself caught in a cycle of drama that threatened both her emotional well-being and her career momentum. For audiences who only saw red carpet smiles and glittering gowns, the idea that these women, two of the most glamorous stars of their generation, were bound together by such a destructive man was almost unthinkable. Yet it was true. And as Collins pulled away from Hilton, she could not help but feel as though Taylor's shadow followed her everywhere. But life in Hollywood is never a straight line. Rivals can become allies, enemies can find common ground, and even the most bitter comparisons can turn into unexpected camaraderie. And that is exactly what would happen when Collins and Taylor crossed paths again years later. This time, not as rivals, but as co-stars. For years, Joan Collins and Elizabeth Taylor were spoken of in the same breath. Two striking brunettes, both born in London, both chasing the same coveted roles, and both carrying the weight of their glamorous reputations. The rivalry narrative was irresistible to gossip columnists who painted them as perfect foils for one another. Taylor was cast as Hollywood royalty, the violet-eyed beauty who could bend entire studios to her will, while Collins was portrayed as the fiery upstart, glamorous, but always just one step behind. For a long time, it seemed like the tension between them would last forever, frozen in tabloid ink. But Hollywood has a way of rewriting its stories. By the late 1990s, both women had survived decades of dizzying fame, scandalous headlines, and painful private struggles. Taylor had endured multiple divorces, endless scrutiny over her weight, and serious health crises that left her hospitalized more than once. Collins had reinvented herself brilliantly in the 80s, stealing the spotlight as Alexis Carrington on Dynasty, proving she was far more than a nearly Cleopatra. Both women were now legends, each admired for her resilience as much as her beauty. With age came perspective, and the sharp edges of rivalry slowly gave way to a recognition of just how much they had in common. The true turning point came in 2001, when they agreed to appear together in the made-for-television comedy These Old Broads. On paper, it was a light-hearted movie about aging actresses navigating the chaos of Hollywood. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated reunion of women who had once defined an era: Collins, Taylor, Shirley MacLaine, and Debbie Reynolds. For Collins and Taylor, it was more than just another role. It was a symbolic moment, a public truce after decades of whispered hostility. The irony of the project was impossible to ignore. Two women who had once been set against each other by studios and gossip writers were now sharing the screen, laughing at the very industry that had pitted them against one another. On set, Collins admitted she was surprised by Taylor. Beneath the diamonds, beneath the aura of untouchable glamour, Taylor was witty, self-deprecating, and even vulnerable. She was not the aloof rival Collins had imagined for so many years. Instead, she was a survivor who had faced loss, ridicule, and constant attention, yet managed to maintain her warmth. Their time on These Old Broads blossomed into a genuine friendship. Collins spoke warmly of Taylor afterward, praising her generosity, humor, and remarkable ability to remain gracious despite the relentless spotlight she had lived under since childhood. For Taylor, who had battled illness and the loneliness of superstardom, Collins's presence may have been a reminder that they were not so different after all. Both had endured the scrutiny of the world, both had known heartbreak, and both had been forced to fight for longevity in a business that often discards women once their youth begins to fade. The film itself was not a runaway hit, but its cultural meaning outweighed its ratings. Viewers were not just watching a comedy, they were witnessing a reconciliation. After decades of being defined as rivals, Collins and Taylor had found common ground, reminding audiences that the stories the tabloids sell are rarely the whole truth. For once, they were not competitors. They were allies, laughing together on screen, reclaiming reclaiming the narrative the press had written for them so many years before. And yet, while the friendship was real, Collins was not ready to let Hollywood off the hook. In the years that followed, she began peeling back the layers of glamour in her interviews and memoirs, exposing the darker truths of the system that had nearly destroyed both her and Taylor. She was ready to reveal just how treacherous the road to stardom had really been. For much of her career, Joan Collins was portrayed as the glamorous beauty who had it all: fame, fortune, and elegance. Her face graced magazine covers, her name was linked to powerful men, and her roles projected an image of effortless success. But when she began speaking more candidly in interviews and in her revealing documentary, This Is Joan Collins, a darker picture emerged. Beneath the sparkle of Hollywood's golden age was an industry riddled with manipulation, predatory studio bosses, and constant pressure to conform. And Collins revealed that she and Elizabeth Taylor were two women who endured the worst of it and somehow lived to tell the tale. Collins described being propositioned by studio executives when she was just starting out. She recalled how these men, holding the keys to every casting decision, expected compliance as the price for a career. Her refusal to engage in what was then openly known as the casting couch culture came at a cost. She was branded difficult. Roles that had once seemed within reach suddenly slipped away. Contracts stalled without explanation. Auditions dried up. She even remembered one powerful producer telling her to her face, "If you do not play the game, you will not get the part." Collins refused. But in a system that thrived on silence and submission, that refusal made her a target. Elizabeth Taylor, by contrast, seemed insulated by her fame. But even she was not spared the suffocating control of the studio system. By the time she was in her 20s, she had already proven herself one of the most bankable stars in the world. Yet studios monitored her every move, dictated who she should be seen with, and crafted publicity stunts designed to polish her image. Taylor's life was not her own. It was a carefully managed production, with her private choices scrutinized and packaged for public consumption. When her real-life scandals broke through, most infamously her torrid affair with Richard Burton during Cleopatra, the industry that had once worshipped her suddenly turned on her. The same newspapers that once called her America's sweetheart branded her a homewrecker. But Taylor refused to be crushed by the backlash. She leaned into it. When studios tried to punish her, she raised her asking price, demanding sums that shocked executives and set new standards for female stars. When tabloids tried to shame her, she gave them bigger headlines, flaunting the diamonds Burton showered her with, appearing at public events on her own terms, and refusing to apologize for her choices. She turned scandal into power, mastering the very system that had tried to bring her down. Collins often spoke of her admiration for Taylor's strength in those moments. Though they had once been rivals, she could not ignore the grit it took for Taylor to survive such scrutiny. Collins recognized that same resilience in herself. She had refused to bend to the casting couch. She had survived being written off. She had endured decades of comparisons that framed her as less than Elizabeth Taylor. And still, she had risen again with Dynasty, proving she could reinvent herself when Hollywood thought she was finished. Yet survival came with scars. Collins later admitted that her refusal to compromise may have cost her Cleopatra and other career-defining roles. She acknowledged that Taylor's willingness to fight, no matter the cost, often landed her in the center of scandal, but it also cemented her as a symbol of independence. Together, they revealed the cracks in the Hollywood machine long before the industry was ready to confront its own abuses. This shared experience created an unspoken bond between Collins and Taylor. They were no longer just rivals. They were veterans of a war few outsiders could see. Women who had fought battles behind closed doors that were every bit as dramatic as their on-screen performances. And when Collins later put her stories into writing, she made it clear that the truth of old Hollywood was far more ruthless than the glossy photographs ever suggested. But Collins's candor did not end with her documentary. In her later memoirs, she pulled back the curtain even further, offering fresh anecdotes about Taylor, their rivalry, and the dangerous, glittering world they navigated together. And those revelations added yet another surprising twist to their saga. For decades, Joan Collins kept much of her rivalry with Elizabeth Taylor behind a veil of glamour. She smiled for cameras, gave witty sound bites, and rarely let the cracks show. But as she grew older, she became far more candid. Her memoirs, especially her recent book, Behind the Shoulder Pads, Tales I Only Tell My Friends, reveal a woman who who is no longer interested in protecting the myths of Hollywood. Instead, she tells the stories exactly as she remembers them, even when they sting. Collins admits that Taylor always seemed to have the upper hand, both on screen and off. She wrote about the Cleopatra heartbreak, making it clear that losing that role haunted her career. She also spoke openly about feeling like Taylor stole not just the part, but the men in her orbit. Nikki Hilton was one example, but Collins hinted at others, suggesting that Taylor's allure had a way of pulling attention, whether or not she wanted it to. Collins did not frame this as hatred. Rather, she painted it as an ongoing frustration of being forever compared to someone whose fame was overwhelming. Her memoirs also highlight how Hollywood thrived on pitting women against one another. Collins reflected on the tabloid culture of the 50s and 60s, which loved to manufacture rivalries. Reporters thrived on the image of Collins versus Taylor, constantly writing that one was the British beauty, while the other was the Hollywood queen. Even when the women were not fighting, the press insisted they were. Collins admitted that at times she fed into it, making sharp remarks about Taylor, but in hindsight, she recognized that they were both victims of the same narrative. Still, Collins could not resist giving readers the kind of stories tabloids would have killed for back then. She detailed her volatile time with Hilton, drawing uncomfortable parallels to Taylor's own marriage. She offered behind-the-scenes glimpses of Hollywood parties where Taylor dominated the room. She even wrote about the jewels, the clothes, and the extravagant lifestyle that made Taylor a symbol of excess, while Collins often felt like she was chasing after the same spotlight. These anecdotes, written with her trademark dry humor, gave readers a sense of just how personal the rivalry had felt to her. But what makes Collins's memoirs so compelling is not just the gossip. It is the honesty. She admitted her envy. She confessed her regrets. She acknowledged the times when bitterness clouded her perspective. And in doing so, she gave a more human, nuanced picture of Elizabeth Taylor than the one-dimensional goddess Hollywood had created. To Collins, Taylor was not just a rival. She was a flawed, fascinating, brilliant woman who made mistakes, took risks, and lived life on her own terms. By putting these reflections on paper, Collins gave fans something they had never truly seen before: the private thoughts of a woman who had lived in Taylor's shadow, but had also, eventually, found her own light. And as she looked back, she made it clear that their story was not just about rivalry. It was about survival, resilience, and the complicated respect that grows only after a lifetime in the spotlight. But Collins's reflections did not stop at the personal level. In the end, she wanted people to see the bigger lesson hidden in her rivalry with Taylor, a truth about power, jealousy, and redemption that stretched far beyond Hollywood. Looking back now, the story of Joan Collins and Elizabeth Taylor reads like a Hollywood epic of its own. It had everything: dazzling highs, bitter disappointments, tangled romances, and surprising reconciliations. It began with Cleopatra, a role Collins believed would make her a legend, only to watch Taylor step into it and turn it into one of the most famous performances in film history. The rivalry deepened when both women found themselves bound to the same destructive man, Nikki Hilton, whose charm hid a violent temper that left lasting scars. For decades, the press thrived on their supposed enmity, painting them as eternal opposites locked in competition, as though only one could reign as Hollywood's queen. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. By the time Collins and Taylor stood side by side in These Old Broads, they were no longer young women chasing roles or battling headlines. They were seasoned survivors of an industry that demanded everything and gave back very little. They had both been adored, betrayed, exploited, and celebrated in equal measure. And in that shared experience, Collins discovered something unexpected. Taylor was not just the woman who stole Cleopatra. She was someone who had carried as many burdens as she had herself. Their shared resilience became a bridge that erased decades of bitterness. In her memoirs, Collins admitted what she had never said out loud during the height of their rivalry. She envied Taylor. She felt overshadowed by her fame, but she also admired her wit, her generosity, and her ability to endure constant scrutiny without losing her spirit. To Collins, the truth about Elizabeth Taylor was never the illusion of an untouchable goddess dripping in diamonds. It was the truth of a woman who fought back against an industry that tried to break her, the very same way Collins had done. Their story is a reminder that rivalry does not always end in hatred. Sometimes it transforms into respect. Sometimes it forces you you to confront your own insecurities by seeing them reflected in someone else. And sometimes it evolves into an understanding that only comes with age. At 92, Collins no longer hides behind Hollywood illusions. She admits the envy, the hurt, and the admiration all at once, peeling back the myths to reveal the humanity beneath the glamour. In the end, the tale of Collins and Taylor is less about who won and who lost, and more about how both women survive. Fame may fade, scandals may be forgotten, but the human truths of jealousy, survival, and eventual forgiveness are what endure. And in that truth lies the most surprising twist of all. Their rivalry was never just about Cleopatra, or men, or headlines. It was about two women who, against all odds, carved their names into history, and who, in their own ways, learned to respect each other for it. If you found Joan Collins's untold truth about Elizabeth Taylor as fascinating as I did, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that peel back the curtain on Hollywood's greatest legends. And let me know in the comments, do you think their rivalry defined them, or was it their resilience that truly made them unforgettable?